So welcome to the first, but what should be the third lecture in CVSP 203 this semester. I'm Courtney Fugate, the director of CVSP, and also one of the principal designers of this course, which is a new course. Because you haven't had these previous lectures, my apology. We have a spate of people on leave this semester who would have given those lectures. But that hopefully has given you extra class time to discuss these texts. Because of that, I won't launch directly into the topic for this week, which is the scientific revolution, but I'll say some of the basic things that you might have heard in the other lectures. First of all, also, hopefully you have the handout. This is all of my slides, right? Also, if you have a question as I'm going, feel free to raise your hand. I will not be reading a text, but I'll kind of casually take you through the slides. So first of all, hopefully by now, you've gotten some understanding of what this course is all about. It is, in fact, as I said, a new style of course in CVSP. It's new both in that it has this reader that you are handling, and in that it goes through a great number of texts, but those are selected and placed into blocks under certain general themes. This is the only CVSP core course that has that feature. And in the selection of those texts, it might be helpful for you I think you've probably already recognized that there's a series of kind of guiding questions at the beginning of each topic. Those were things that would have been covered in the previous lectures or might be covered in future lectures. Those are also very good, at least when I give the course, very good study questions. So read those questions before you go through each section of the reading and keep those in mind. Another aspect that you may not have recognized yet about the reader is that each of the blocks, the texts in each block are selected, particularly from here on out, in order to give you a broad view of the different and contrasting perspectives on various topics. So there are ways you can teach something like the modern period. There are many ways. One way is to select texts that kind of reinforce one kind of grand narrative of the tradition. And we explicitly tried to get away from that to show that the modern tradition that we're going through, the making of the modern world in Europe, was something about which there was almost no agreement. So on every topic that looks like agreement, we all want to be enlightened. You'll see that in the Enlightenment. But when you dig down into what individuals said about what enlightenment is, you'll see that they have completely opposed views of the very meaning of the term. They both champion enlightenment, but they have completely opposite views of what it is. So also this week we'll talk about the scientific revolution, and you'll see that what science is, there is no agreement on that. Everybody loves science that we're going to be reading, right? But they look at each other and say, you are not doing science. I'm the one doing science. And my conception of science is the correct one, which shows at the very beginning of science, no one really knew what science was. They were trying to figure that out. And that is something over which there was intense and very important debate. And all the views that we now hold, of science and you'll see of politics and of things that we see later in this course, all those things are the result not of one of these thinkers, but of the continuing and at the time very sometimes violent conflicts and debates between these various thinkers. And so if you look we're going to go through some aspects of the scientific revolution today, but you'll see that the concept of science that we hold is a hybrid of these two what initially were very, very opposed views of what science was. And we found some balance, and you'll see this theme coming throughout. Okay, so you began the course with which text? Copernicus. When was Copernicus published? When did he publish On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres? 1543? Yeah, not the 17th century. Keep this in mind, right? This course spans from 1543 until the 1840s. So you're spanning, 300 years within this one course. So when you were reading the text at the beginning, you had a text from from Copernicus from 1543, and then you read a text by Alexander Pope, which was from very much later, right? Keep these times in mind because we're talking about a kind of development in this course. It begins from the kind of outbreak of science and kind of this, belief in the harmony and structure of the universe and how that science that reached that view could be applied elsewhere. And we see that develop from that point onward, from the 1500s. So as you'll see in the scientific revolution, we're later, right? Descartes died in 1650. This is almost 100 years after, he dies almost 100 years after Copernicus published his book. They're still trying to figure out what science is, right? 100 years after Copernicus. And when you read in the next section on political economy, you'll see that essentially what is happening there is attempts to apply these various types of science, these various conceptions of science, to political theory, right? In order to reach, so that there was this, from the beginning of the modern period, there was this belief, guided by a very confused idea of science, that somehow science would be applicable and would be able to revolutionize all areas of human activity. And there were these various attempts, and what we now, some of you are maybe in political science, the invention of political science took place in this period through the belief that the kind of science that was being used by Copernicus could be applied to human societies. Right? And that's the natural kind of progression that took place. Eventually, in the 18th century, people were writing books on, the first aesthetics book on beauty was published that was supposed to be a science of beauty. And it was through the application of what that author believed to be the method of science to problems of art and aesthetics. Right? So it's this continuous progression in which science is increasingly applied. And as you'll see, towards the end of this course, that kind of belief in science begins to some extent crumble, or at least in the belief that science is something very simple, and that it's kind of that very simple method of, either doing experimentation, as we'll see in Bacon, or doing some kind of deductive, logical, mathematical reasoning. There's still a belief, and you'll see till the end of this course, there will be a belief that the world is ordered and structured in kind of a systematic and harmonious way that makes science possible. But there's an increasing disbelief in the ability of the human mind to grasp that. So we'll see reason, you'll see the term reason used all throughout this course as the kind of faculty of the mind that allows science and is the basis of science, right? Allows science to be possible. And at the end of this course, you'll see various attempts to go beyond reason. Not because science is not true, not because the world is not deeply systematic and organized in a way that would make knowledge possible, but it's rather that it's so organized and so complex that the mind cannot quite grasp it. And then you get to move over into something called romanticism, right? And some attempts to conceive of a new, higher kind of reason. You'll see this in Hegel. So that's kind of the broad sweep of the course. Today, I want to say a few things in particular about the scientific revolution. For this week, you read two texts. You read some text from Francis Bacon. What's important when you're reading Bacon, or there are many important things, but there are several types of selections in your reading. The first kind of selection is like introduction. It's very important when you read a book, particularly a historical book, to read the introduction very carefully, because that's usually where all the important, memorable stuff is, in fact, because what we're interested in is kind of the project, the vision that someone like Bacon had, and this you get particularly through the introductions. Today, when I get a book, I just skip the introduction generally, but when you're looking at historical books, introductions are key, and they save you a lot of time as well, because they usually say right up front what they want and how they want to achieve it. And you'll see in Bacon's introduction that he has a kind of very immense, kind of vision of a whole society in which science will become kind of the central focus. And this is doubled in the last part of your reading of Bacon, which is from the New Atlantist. Hopefully, I don't know if, are you assigning it? the New Atlantis? I'll find out later. Even if it's not assigned in your course, often my students enjoy the New Atlantis more than anything else in the first half of the course because it's so strange. Because we all have this notion of what science should be like, and we say, okay, Bacon's an empiricist. We'll get more into what that means. He believes you should follow your senses. And then when he sits down to write the New Atlantis, which is a kind of scientific utopia, it becomes very, very strange. Right, it's a hyper-Christianized, male-dominated society in which there's a almost secret group of a few men who run scientific experiments in all these various ways. And it's even informative about what Bacon believes science should be interested in, things we would not even imagine. For instance, one of the things you'll see in the New Atlantis is that the scientific institutions have these enormous places where you can experience various kinds of illusions, because the senses are the key to knowledge, and so Bacon thinks you have to study the illusions of the senses in order to do science well. And so that, I don't know of anywhere, maybe museums for kids where you get a focus in science on illusions, but for Bacon it was really a central aspect. And so that, even if you isn't assigned, I would recommend reading the New Atlantis. They're quite fascinating. The middle part is from a multi-volume work that Bacon projected, which would lay down the foundations of science, describe all previous science, and lay out the foundations for such a scientific society. And Bacon was instrumental in all of this, in bringing about a kind of social change with respect to science. A change in the government, the relationship between science and political organizations. And it was through Bacon's work that eventually the Royal Society of London, the Royal Society, was created, something funded by the government, by the king, in order to fuel science. Science would and was undermining political authority, as you'll see in the political science. Right? It gave new foundations to political authority by saying that political authority was no longer founded in a kind of king being placed there by God in some way or by succession, but could be made legitimate through what was justified by applying a science to political organization and showing that government was the best organization. This is what you'll kind of see later. And so even while it's starting to undermine political authority and religious authority, I think you probably saw that and talked about that in Copernicus, undermining religious authority, there was, through people like Bacon, an attempt to bring the authority of science under the government in some way. And so it was in the wake of Bacon and his kind of vision of an institution of science that the first scientific journals and the first scientific institutions were created. And in its wake was founded the French Academy of the Sciences and the Berlin Academy of Sciences, and this kind of totally revolutionized. Before someone like Bacon, if you're doing, or Descartes even at the same time, if you were doing science, you were doing it in your home. It wasn't being done and supported by organizations, right? This started in this period. Okay. So the other text that you'll read in this block is by René Descartes. It's from his book called The Principles of Philosophy. I think many of you are probably familiar with Descartes. I think, therefore, I am. Every student knows this phrase. This is from his Meditations on First Philosophy, another work he wrote. The principles that you are reading is from much later in Descartes' career, when he was no longer worried about being banned by the Catholic Church or anything. Early on, he was quite hesitant. He published the Meditations, but before the Meditations, he published a book called The Discourses on the Method. He published it anonymously. And the reason for this was he was still living in the wake of the problems arising from the Copernican revolution, right? And the problems with the Catholic Church. In fact, in the middle of Descartes' career, the Catholic Church condemned Galileo. This was in 1632, right? I said Descartes died in 1650. Descartes, up until that point, was a scientist. He was working in the early modern tradition. He believed the world was a machine. He studied mathematics very intensively. And he was interested in coming up, as everyone was at the time, with a true method of science that would solve all scientific problems. This was what they were all working on and conceiving that. And when he was about to publish his work, which was very much in line with Copernicus and Galileo, the condemnation came down, and he suppressed his physics. And then he turned into a philosopher very quickly because he realized that in order to justify the new science, well, first of all, the new science needed justification. The old philosophy justified a different kind of science. It was in line with the Aristotelian science of the church and of scholastic philosophy. And so the key idea of this new science was that mathematics is really the essential aspect of nature, and that by studying mathematics, you can understand nature. And the previous physics, in fact, relied on a kind of belief that mathematics isn't exactly the tool of science. In fact, mathematics can't explain why things are true at all, it only describes them. And this new tradition, if you go to physics class now, you say, why does the ball fall? And you get some equations and so on. And the reason why is explained fully mathematically. Up until, even during, hopefully you noticed this when reading the introduction to the On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, the introduction of that work, in fact, denied that mathematics could give you truth. Right? It wasn't written, that introduction wasn't written by Copernicus, though. That was appended, stuck onto his work right before he died, unknown to him, so that no one would take his new method too seriously, right? Well, this was still playing out in the 1600s, right? Into the 1630s, and it was Galileo who was one of the first people to, in fact, he was a friend of the Pope, and the Pope asked him, was in fact Copernicus, did he believe his new method was the true method and the old Aristotelian method wasn't the right method? And Galileo said, undoubtedly he believed that, right? And Galileo himself wrote a book to support the Copernican theory and got himself condemned even by someone who at one time was his friend. So all of this is in the background of Descartes' the evolution of his thinking. So when he goes to philosophy, he's doing so in order to retreat from science. He knows science can't prove that science is right? Modern science can't prove itself right. So you have to go back one step further and ask yourself, well, what is this new science and how can it be justified? And that became Descartes' central question, right? And he, as you'll notice in the Principles, he does this by going all the way back to God to try to show that God created the world using mathematics. The essence of nature is its mathematical structure. That's quite a bold way of proving modern science is correct. I prove it's right because I prove that God is a scientist, right? And this is essentially what Galileo was thinking as well, right? Many of you, if you go to the Galileo Museum in Florence, you'll see emblazoned on the wall, the book of nature, created by God, the book of nature, is written in symbols, and those symbols are triangles and the symbols of geometry, right? This is what he said. God wrote the world, constructed the world, not through words in the traditional sense of that biblical saying, but through the word in the sense of the symbolic words in mathematics. And so what that would imply, of course, is that only if you understand mathematics can you truly understand God's creation, which is quite a radical claim because most priests were not mathematicians, so you would be definitely undermining authority with that. So this is going on, and Descartes goes all the way back to God to try to justify his new mathematical vision of science. So that's what you'll find in the Principles. And the Principles is kind of his ultimate triumph. He was, in the beginning, he had to keep himself a bit secret about what he was doing, and he wrote letters saying, don't tell anyone. This meditations I wrote is the foundation for a physics, and if anyone finds out, the Aristotelians will have my head. They were still burning and banning people in Paris at the time for teaching anti-Aristotelian theories. And eventually he succeeded, and his book, The Principles, became a textbook that was used in Jesuit universities and in some universities in the early modern period. It was still controversial and radical forever throughout the period, but it was. So what you see there is him transforming and taking his meditations, and in the first part of the text of The Principles, you'll see him laying out the foundations, proving God's existence, proving that God is not a deceiver, proving that the only concepts that are clear in our minds, that we really have knowledge of as mathematical truths, and that since God is not a deceiver, our minds must work correctly, right? And they must, when we use our minds well, represent the truth. And so since mathematics is the example of using your mind well, through mathematics you reach the truth. That's kind of the whole argument he makes in the first part. And then, however, he wants to draw all those, in your text you'll see he draws all the conclusions. If nature is a machine, then the rest of that book of The Principles was supposed to be a theory of basic physics. So he leaps to something that starts to sound like Newton, inertia and all these aspects of nature. And then he moves on to the entire construction of the universe, and then to the human body. And in fact, The Principles was supposed to be a complete science of everything. He didn't finish it. So that is the Principles. That's kind of a brief description of the second text you'll read in this section. So now I'm to my lecture proper. If you check, so from here on you can follow me on the slides, which are in your hand as well. So as I said, it's really important to keep in mind that very early, so at the same time that, 1543, same time that Copernicus is publishing his work, he's not the only person doing stuff that we see as the beginning of early modern science. Lots of people in every area were doing things. They were not the majority, they were generally oddball characters, but they all shared some kind of beginnings of a feeling of familiarity with each other. They read each other's works. There was crossover between anatomy and chemistry and physics, that there was something similar in all of these things. One of the similarities was they all rejected, for the most part, tradition and Aristotelian philosophy. That was one thing they all pretty much shared, though they rejected it for completely different reasons often, depending on what they thought science was really like. But all of this was happening, and no one had yet written anything about modern science. There was no such conception of modern science. What makes science science? You should ask yourself that. It's not an easy question. If you have an answer, I would like to know it. I could make a career if I knew the answer to the question of what makes science work. What is science? What is the proper scientific method? This is what everyone began searching for and looking for. So what happens is often in history and in the modern period is things change, things are published, there's chaos, and people come after the fact and try to theorize that. And both Bacon and Descartes, they're not inventing science. Some people say, Bacon is the father of modern science or things like this. He did not invent anything. Everything he's talking about is in existence while he's speaking, and what he's inventing is the reflection on some vision or some story about what that science is, why it works, and how to perform it, right? And part of that is that justification. Why is this science right versus the old science, the one that came from Aristotle? Why is that wrong? That's part of the story. So some of the things that were going on at the time, Vesalius on the fabric of the human body. What was so remarkable about this work? This is actually really, I wish I had a copy of this. It's my son would love it. He loves monsters and scary things and Halloween. And Vesalius, his book is full of these anatomical descriptions. This is one of the very first, it was quite a taboo thing to dissect dead bodies. It's not very consonant with the notion of resurrection of the body or anything, that you start cutting people up after they're dead. So often these kind of dissections were done in secret. Descartes famously did dissections in secret, and his neighbors from the smell were very unhappy. But in this book, there were published some of the very first descriptions, like these very detailed drawings of the human body, right? And it was in order to capture attention So you can see this is not like your today's anatomy book, right? This is meant to be both artistic and beautiful and yet scientific and descriptive and radical at the same time. It needs to draw attention to itself. So just this description, this kind of minute, disinterested kind of examination of the human body, bracketing all religious problems with it, all personal feelings about it, just trying to see what is there and to describe it in minute detail. Very fundamental work of the period. William Harvey, 1628, it's quite a bit later, right? This is more contemporaneous with Galileo. First person, or one of the first people to provide good evidence for the circulation of the blood. You might say, well, isn't that pretty easy to figure out? But when you are not allowed to do such examinations, there were all kinds of theories about what the blood was there for, whether the heart even was the thing that moved the blood around, right? And it was through experiments and various things that he came up with a theory of this. It's also very, very difficult to understand how a heart would pump, because in the period you didn't have any conception of attraction or of electromagnetism or electricity or any of these things that are required to understand how a muscle can contract. So often the models of the body that people were thinking about were very much like a steam engine, kind of thing, where you got push and pull, and you don't have contraction and things like this. You have strings and you have motors and stuff like that, but you don't have something like a heart. Even Descartes didn't believe the heart pumped in the way that it did. He thought it was more like an engine. So very, very fundamental. This is the title of this book is The Anatomy of the Motion of the Heart and of the Blood in Animals. Galileo, The Starry Messenger. This is the first book that anyone ever published with a picture of the moon's surface in it. That's quite an amazing thing. The telescope was not invented by Galileo, but it was invented just a little bit previous to that by, I think, a Dutch, craftsman, and they were used as toys and for seeing things at a distance. And Galileo was the first person to say, if I build this thing much larger and I point it up in the sky, maybe I can settle some of these disputes that we, Copernicans have with the Aristotelians about nature, right? And one of the ideas that belonged to the old theory of the universe was that the planets, everything from the moon upwards, the superlunary sphere, was such that things did not change. They were perfect. The moon it looks perfectly smooth if you go outside and look at it, right? But it looks like it's got stuff on it, and they said, well, that's kind of like a pearl, It's still smooth and perfect. It's got these areas in it, but it's not like this. It's not like a piece of Swiss cheese like you see in the cartoons, which is what it's really like. That would be impossible. Things up there don't change. There aren't mountains and volcanoes and things. All the planets, they must stay the same. They must be perfect because they are the basis of all time and all change. Right? And if they changed, then change would change, and then we would be in a mess, right? If the universe outside changed, because it's what keeps time for us. But Galileo, just pointing his telescope up, realized there were things going on. He saw craters. He also looked at the sun and saw sunspots, so the sun is not perfect. And these things by themselves didn't prove Copernicus correct, but they chipped away at the edifice that was supporting the previous theories, right? And convince someone like Galileo that Copernicus has absolutely got to be right. So the Starry Messenger, absolutely, fundamental, monumental work published. And all it did was have pictures, drawn pictures of these things. And when it came out, people still denied it was true. There were some issues with optics, I'll tell you about that in a second, that made it difficult for people to confirm his theory there. And by the way, if you go again to that Galileo Museum in Florence, you'll see his original telescopes. It's quite a nice thing to see. Robert Boyle, 1661, the skeptical chemist. Boyle's often referred to, all these names are kind of unfortunate because they downplay other important figures, but Boyle is often referred to as the father of modern chemistry. And this work, he proposes that everything's made of atoms. This is a revival of an ancient theory maybe some of you read about in CVSB 201, right? And that everything is made up from the combination. There aren't just 4 elements, which was the Aristotelian theory. There may be multiple elements, maybe innumerable elements. And there was also another theory in the meantime that came up that there were 3 elements, sulfur, mercury, and something else, like salt, that these were the 3 elements. He also went against this. And it was the beginning of this, what happens with, of course, with atomism is suddenly what makes an element, or not an element, but a compound is the proportion, the mathematical proportion of those elements. So what was fundamental to being able to start to apply mathematics to chemistry was the hypothesis of atomism. Because then you can see why so much hydrogen combines with so much oxygen and you get so much water out, and why the gases are in certain proportions to each other. Those proportions, the idea that the universe is governed by proportions and order and harmony, that's the central idea of Copernicus's work, right? Now here it's being applied, or at least getting the foundations for it to be applied in chemistry. The magnets were and are crazy things, as you know, if you sit down with a few for a while. No one understood what magnets were. They had this terrible problem that you can't understand how magnetic attraction works because it works through empty space. And so there were all kinds of theories about this. Gilbert was the first person to really highlight in the modern period this issue and to conduct experiments to try to prove various things about magnetism. And many of the things we believe about magnetism he discovered. For instance, that the Earth is a large magnet. This is something he built a model Earth out of magnetic material and tried to show that the things that happen with compasses and whatnot can be explained entirely by the Earth having a north and a south pole. And if you read this book, it's quite interesting, even still, because he sees magnets everywhere, as you'll see. Bacon is quite skeptical of someone like Gilbert, although Gilbert is what we'll call an empiricist in the Baconian tradition. He uses experiments. He's so fascinated with the magnet that someone like Bacon rejects him as an ant. You'll see this analogy, an ant rather than a bee, because he just collects information about some specific topic, magnets. And finally, this book by Kepler, I was saying that there were some issues with justifying the use of telescopes, right? It's just like with mathematics. The question, when you start using mathematics and physics, the question is, well, why should mathematics be the key to knowing nature, right? It's just this stuff on paper people draw in their schools, right? Why should that be the key to science? So also, many people were skeptical. You had to prove that telescopes, what they did and how they worked, or else no one was going to believe that the image, I can make a tube and make you look into it and show you all kinds of things. Why is what you're seeing through a telescope in particular supposed to be a true representation? You had to understand how the eye works and how telescopes work. And it's much more complicated than you might think, because you can't just stick anyone's eye in front of the same telescope and see the same things. When people used Galileo's telescopes, they couldn't see what he saw because they had a different, a different eyeball, and so you've got to use a little corrector on telescopes. So he was probably very confused when he didn't understand that people would look through his telescope and just see a blurry moon and not a crisp moon, right? So all these things had to be investigated before you could kind of broadly get them received. Okay. So now the simple part. Simple because I'm oversimplifying. From here in the lecture, I'm going to talk about these two different traditions, these two opposed traditions. I'm going to call them traditions. I put it here with a small t because there was no head figure, leader. Often they did look back to these figures. I'll talk about Bacon and Descartes. But these are two small traditions, and there were people in between these two traditions. But you see in Descartes and Bacon, these two traditions kind of starkly contrasted, right? And I'm going to continue that contrast even though it doesn't fully represent the kind of complexity of the issue. And so we could say there is, generally speaking, a tradition of Bacon, right? Found, or not founded, but carried through and made popular by Francis Bacon. And this is often today called empiricism, or I would prefer to call it the experimental inductive tradition. The two elements there, right? So this is a theory about what science is. What makes science work is that it is experimental, meaning it attends to the objects of our senses first and foremost. It doesn't start with theories or anything. It doesn't start with geometry. It starts with perception itself. And it takes perception as the fundamental guide to what is true, with one caveat. That it's not that you just perceive things to find out what is true, but you have to carry out experiments on those perceptions. If you stick water in a glass, if you put water in a glass and put a straw in it, the straw looks broken, yeah? Because of the refractive index of the water. If I were just following my senses, I'd have to say I stick it in the water and it breaks, right? And then I pull it out and it goes back together. If I were just following my senses. Senses are deceptive, Bacon realized. Empiricism is not based on a fundamental belief in the truth of the senses, but it is based upon the idea that all truth comes by way of the senses when those senses are subjected to experimental scrutiny. That's why experimental is fundamental here. And you'll see that in the text. Bacon always warns people who just follow their senses. That's just nonsense, in fact. The senses, he says, are the most deceptive things. They're even more deceptive than the mind, although he wants to follow them, because he has ways of correcting the senses, and the senses are closer to the truth than the mind is. So even if you correct the mind and you just go the direction of the mind, you'll never get to the truth. The senses confuse things, but at least we can correct them, and they are connected with the truth through that correction, right? That's the difference. Now, it's inductive. Some of you may be familiar with this notion of induction. I think since you were a child, you did things like, if I do that, my mother will slap me. Because you did it once and she slapped you, and you did it again and she slapped you, and you did it again and she slapped you, and then you I've made an induction from individual cases to the general case, and then I can plan for the future. Don't do that in the future, because if you did that, you will get smacked, right? That is, in essence, the notion of induction that goes all the way back to ancient times. Aristotle knew you should do induction. Bacon's not new on induction. What is new in his experimental inductive method is the emphasis on the experiments as the key to induction, and in the idea that induction is a very, very complicated thing that needs to be regulated by all kinds of meta practices, right? So you can't just, he'd say that case I gave you of the child, that's a very bad induction, because the child maybe says, if I play with a toy, my mother smacks me. If I play with a toy, and they've made a very bad induction, because it may just be the iPad that she smacks you with, and not every toy. But you never tried the other toys. You only tried the iPad, right? And so your induction was a very poor one, because you didn't look for cases where the thing would not follow, right? You didn't look for exceptions that, although they are exceptions, seemingly exceptions to the rule you learned by induction, they're not exceptions from the true rules. They're just indications that the true rule is that when you pick up the iPad, you get smacked, and when you pick up an educational toy, you don't, right? That's the true rule. And so Bacon, in fact, theorizes that we should have this kind of system, a government-funded system for recording experiments in vast detail and looking for extreme conditions in which to carry out experiments. Nevertheless, it's going to be inductive, right? It's just that kind of intense focus on looking for the exceptions and trying to avoid the illusions that simple induction would cause or allow. That's the key. So the idea of Bacon is you move from experience to theories, or I put from experience towards principles. From the effects, everyone admits that the things, getting smacked is the effect. And by learning the rule, I learned the reason for the effect, the causes. All right? So in induction, you go from the effects to the causes of those effects, right? Regressively, not progressively. Examples of figures in this tradition broadly are Gilbert, the magnet, the guy who studied the magnet, Bacon himself, Vesalius, Boyle with chemistry. These are all people broadly within the tradition, would be recognized in the tradition of Bacon. You can see why chemistry would have to start there, because chemical theories come really at the end of things. You've got to do so much experimentation at the very beginning. Same thing with the human body. How many general theories do we have about the structure of the human body? Not very many. But so you have to start with examination and experimentation for those sciences really to get anywhere. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, the Baconian tradition opposed Aristotle, as did pretty much everyone, because Aristotle was the figurehead, supposedly, of this older science. But they opposed him, as you'll see from the text, because he was too speculative and too theoretical, right? The exact opposite of the image they painted of themselves. Right, we stick to the senses. Aristotle was a theoretician. He just went off into these quick theories, you'll see. Bacon will say the inductions of, everyone starts with inductions, but Aristotle's inductions just leapt from the particulars to the universals immediately, right? It was just too theoretical, too quick, not careful enough, flying to first principles. Bacon's tradition, it distrusts the senses also, as I said, but most of all, it distrusts the unaided intellect. So mere theorizing is the kind of demon opposite of someone like Bacon. So much so that you'll see in his text that he puts the theorizing kind of, someday we'll get to theories, right? Not now, not in this foreseeable future. That's not the important thing. Now the tradition, the opposing tradition, the one by Descartes, is just as one-sided, as you'll see. And it's based essentially on this view that the senses do not give us truth at all. Everything, all truth really has its origin in the unaided, which by Descartes would be the uncorrupted, intellect. If we can just purify our intellects and follow only our intellects and bracket everything we sense and perceive and we are told, then for the first time we will discover truth. All right, so Descartes looks like they're explaining the same thing, modern science. They've completely opposed views of what it means and how it functions. So I call this tradition the mathematical deductive tradition. It's mathematical. The key to science is mathematics, concepts, ideas, and it is deductive, meaning rather than starting with particulars and going to first principles someday, it starts immediately with first principles, basic concepts, the causes of things, and tries to deduce everything from that. So when you read the principles, you'll see Descartes begins with the very foundation of his method in the first book, and then the basic laws of nature, and then from the basic laws of nature to the particular structures of nature. And it should be, if the first principles are absolutely secure and certain, then he doesn't ever need to look, well, I mean, with some caveats, he doesn't really have to look through telescopes or do experimentation. And in fact, this was kind of although he did do experimentation and things, this was more a kind of shortcut to try to figure some things out that would take a long time to deduce, rather than some new method, right? And those things were always subject to the question of whether they fit the basic principles. And I could digress there on a nice story, but I won't. This tradition, too, opposes Aristotle as the figurehead of the old science. But as opposed to the other tradition saw Aristotle as too speculative. You'll see Descartes thinks that Aristotle relies too much on the senses. This is also found in Galileo's writings, when the scholastics, the Aristotelians, are talking in his dialogues. They believe in the senses. They say the fundamental principle that Aristotle taught us is you have to trust the senses. And they say that's why they oppose Copernicus. Look, I'm not moving. I can feel that I'm not moving. So I cannot be flying around the sun at thousands of miles an hour. You're insane, right? I follow the senses. Now, Bacon would have Bacon also rejected Copernicanism, which is a funny story, but not for those reasons, right? So for Descartes and the Cartesian tradition, they will always paint the medieval tradition as overly, simplistically reliant on their senses. One of the objections to mathematics being the key to science that was put in the mouths of the Aristotelians by Galileo was that, look, there are no perfect spheres in the world, so I can't use them doing science. They don't exist. Find me a perfect sphere, and I'll admit what you say about perfect spheres is true, but that's not true of any sphere that you'll ever see, because none of those spheres are perfect, right? So that whole idea of idealization and modeling that we use in science today was something the Aristotelian tradition did not support as a key to the truth. So the tradition of Descartes, obviously, it distrusts the senses, actually so far as to say the senses do not reveal the truth at all without, now they can down the line only if they have been, to the extent that they are guaranteed by an inner intellectual foundation. And it finds complete source, as I said, in the unaided, or as Descartes would say, the uncorrupted intellect, right? The uncorrupted and you'll see that all our errors for Descartes come from the use of our freedom, when we freely hold as true things that our intellect doesn't represent as true. And so it's not just the uncorrupted intellect, but also the well-trained intellect, the one that isn't too ambitious to say more than it knows. Then you are guaranteed to have truth for Descartes. Okay, 5 minutes here, not too bad. The tradition of Bacon, I'll go through this very quickly, it focuses on the design of experiments, on methodological comparison and sifting on results, and on technological advancements. It makes little use of mathematics. It is not very allied, you could see, with the Copernican. Copernicus is kind of in that tradition of Descartes, right? Or at least was taken up into the tradition of Descartes, although he's previous to Descartes. Because astronomy is such a perfectly nice place to use mathematics, right? And Copernicus himself held that, he says in the text that you read, that you have to have the mind of a mathematician to see the order and harmony of his new system, right? So it wasn't very much embraced by the Baconian tradition at all. And it sees this, one kind of interesting difference is the Baconian tradition doesn't really see much of a conflict between religion and science. Because using your senses, this theory doesn't really fundamentally give you a new way to make big theories, things that would challenge religious theories, right, very easily. Because you're not making big theories at the beginning, or even soon, but much, much later. So you can see this in the New Atlantis. It's kind of a hyper-Christianized world he envisions, where science and Christianity and nature all fit together, and male authority, all fit together into this kind of strange unity. Now, of course, later, when you get to someone like, in 204, you'll read Darwin, who's in the tradition of Bacon. Then when you start talking about evolution and the nature of man and things, then religion and science get into some issues, right? But not until much later does that happen. Descartes' tradition, as I said, it's born right there with Galileo and the condemnation of Copernicus. So the relationship between religion is absolutely central, which is exactly why you'll see Descartes begins with a proof of God's existence. Because, this is very clever, isn't it? If you're being charged with undermining the church's authority, and you say, well, look, that Aristotle, everybody recognized that Aristotle had problems as a Christian philosopher. He believed in the eternity of the world. His God was not a creator God. And Descartes' first move is to say, look, my philosophy supports the proof of a God that is much more Christian than Aristotle's God. So maybe my physics is better too. That's slightly cynical, but it's quite accurate, I think, of the way it worked in Descartes' mind. Although he was truly religious, I believe. What can I say? The quotations on the next few pages just fill out a lot of what I've said. This is important, though. I'll say something here. One of the key questions, I give you a couple slides later, some main questions to think about, because these were the questions that kind of these two figures focused on. And they're really basic questions, what is science? Why does science work? What is the criterion of truth to apply in the sciences, and so on. But this also, when you get to the issue of a criterion of truth, one of the things that makes their traditions look so different is that if you're in the Baconian tradition, your real emphasis is really on avoiding the errors of the senses. You'll see he has all these idols he creates to try to teach you about the errors of the senses. And you don't have any broad theory to guarantee truth other than following empiricism, right? But empiricism, well, how do you know that your inductions are true inductions? What's the criteria for that? Well, Bacon realized, well, if I don't have any theoretical guarantee, the proof is the fruits. The proof is that, the proof of quantum theory is that your cell phone works, right? This is the way he would think. It's not because someone guaranteed the quantum theory is true through some deductive method going back to God and the intellect. It's because your cell phone works, because it can be used, because I can, with this laser pointer, if I pull out a hair and put it in front of it, I won't do that. But if I did, you'll see a diffraction pattern on the ceiling, which shows one aspect of the quantum character of light and its wave-like properties. I can demonstrate, I can show you things, I can produce things, fruits, right? The benefits. Science is true because it leads to benefits, not because it gives us insight into the fundamental reality necessarily. And so that is, when you look at Descartes or Bacon's New Atlantis, his society is full of museums for the display of the fruits, and he says there should be a statue for each person who has invented a new technology, right? Going all the way back, including Columbus, kind of a strange story, why he's there. Inventors and discoverers, those are the key people that are kind of the signposts that science is progressing, right? Discoverers and inventors of technology and things. So fruits. For Bacon, the ultimate goal of science is to put man back in charge of nature. It says, by science, God gave us science to restore the power over nature that man lost, right? So it's about power and about control and about fruits. Descartes, on the other hand, his entire guarantee of truth has nothing to do with fruits. You'll see in his discussion, he has a tree, and metaphysics is the root, and his philosophy is the roots, right? And the fruits, he says, well, they'll come one day, right? The fruits are not important right now. What's important is having a clear, distinct, meaning certain and indubitable understanding of the fundamental principles, right? That's our first order of business. We'll get to the fruits one day, right? And so even when he's in his book on his anonymous book he published on the discourses on the method, part of the fruits is like how I should act. It's ethics, right? And so he says, while I am doing science, I will bracket ethics, and I will reform it when I'm done with science. I'll bracket it now because I don't know what to do, right? And science can't tell me, and also church people don't worry, because I'm not going to radically change anything for the time being that's relevant to that. But one day I will, right? So the first principles, fruits, they come. Okay, thank you very much.